Okay, so I'm now going to hand over to Cath Shellswell, who's going to tell us about the fantastic talk that Cath and her colleagues are going to give to us today. So over to you, Cath.
Thank you very much. Well, hopefully you can all hear me and you can also all see the presentation. I'm sure that Kieran will let me know if there's any technical problems. So we're here to talk about Colour and Margins, which is a Back from the Brink project. And we thought we would kick off with a short quiz for you all. It's only a bit of fun. And so you should see appearing on your screen now a poll with these questions on it. We'll give you a couple of minutes to answer, and really, unfortunately, the way that the polls work, you won't get your own answers, but you'll see what the combined answers are. So just make a note, a mental note of what your answer is, and the next slide actually gives you the answers as well. So
just to let everybody know as well, there are 10 questions on the poll, so you will need to scroll down to answer them all. So make sure you get all 10, and you'll need to scroll down. So there's one answer for each question.
Thanks. So while everyone's just answering that, I'll introduce myself and my colleagues. My name's Cath. I work on Colour in the Margins. And manage the project with Lizzie Cook, who's sitting behind the scenes here, doing a lot of the chats, looking at all your questions, and also putting in some links into the quiz, particularly of crib sheets and identification aids that you could use. We also have Hannah Gibbons, who is going to be talking about arable plants on sandy and shale soils, where she mostly works, and Alison Mitchell, who is going to be talking about clay arable plants of clay soils. So we're going to cover quite a variety of different groups of plants today, and this presentation is really a bit of a mixture between ID and a little bit about actually some of the things that we found out through the 3-year project. I'm going to start us off giving you an introduction to the Back from the Brink programme and also Colour in the Margins, what we're trying to achieve. So I'll go through some of the questions, and just so that everyone has a little bit more of a chance to kind of answer them. So we ask you, which soil type has the most diverse arable plant community, whether that's clay, sands and shales, or calcareous chalk and limestone? How many species of poppy are commonly found on arable land in the UK? So that's either 4, 5 or 6. Which species of bird is also known as a wailing heath chicken? Is it a curlew, stone curlew, or bittern? What is the myth surrounding the origin of pheasant's eye? So they sprang from Aphrodite's tears, Zeus's thunderbolts, or Poseidon's trident. How many species of beetles are there in the UK? So about 2,000, about 4,000, or about 6,000. What is the favourite chick food of Searle buntings? Is it ground beetles, caterpillars, or grasshoppers? Number 7 is, what is the best type of management for arable plants? Cultivated uncropped margins, wildflower margins, nectar and pollen margins. What is another name for lesser snapdragon? Is it dog's head, weasel snout, or horse's face? And how many SSIs are designated for arable plant communities in the UK? Is it 3, 4, or 5? And the final question of this set is, what is stinking camomile thought to smell like? Is it cough medicine, vomit, or lemon? So hopefully you've all had enough time to do that. And Kieran, I'm not so familiar with this. If I go to the end polling, it shows here. So we'll just go through it. So the answers are: the most diverse arable plant communities on calcareous chalk and limestone, which most of you got. The species of bird known as the wailing heath chicken is the stone curlew, which we were amazed to find out. Aphrodite's tears is sorry, how the number of species of poppy commonly found on arable land is 5. Aphrodite's tears was the myth surrounding pheasant's eye. Oh, sorry. And there are about 4,000 beetles. The favourite chick food of solar buntings is grasshoppers. Cultivated uncropped margins is the best type of management for arable plants. Weasel snout is another name for lesser snapdragon. There are 3 SSSIs designated for arable plant communities, but there are more SSSIs that have arable land in them. It's just that they're not designated for the arable plant community present. And the final one is stinky camel supposedly smells like sick. So we thought that would be an amusing one for everyone to end on. So I think that's the end of the poll. I'm going to crack on with the talk now and tell you a little bit about Back from the Brink, first of all. So it's the most ambitious conservation programme of works that's ever really been undertaken in England. And the aim is to save 20 species from extinction and benefit over 200 more by doing works in those species. And it includes species from the Cornish path moss in all the way up to, you know, the polecat, which is in Northumberland, and everything in between, from invertebrates to other types of mammals to birds. So it's a fantastic range of work. So there are 12 single species projects, which are very, very focused, and then 7 integrated projects. And Colour in the Margins is an integrated project. We work on 10 arable plant species in particular, and 3 ground beetle species. There are a number of different organisations that have taken part in this programme work. It's been going since 2018. Plant Life and the RSPB are the partners working on Colour in the Margins. There are a few partners that aren't on here, such as Northumberland Wildlife Trust. And we also work with a huge number of other organisations like the Vincent Wildlife Trust. So it's a really combined programme of works across the spectrum. And we're funded primarily by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. So they fund the programme in its entirety. And then we also have a number of other partners that fund separate bits of the programme, including the People's Postcode Lottery that have funded Colour in the Margins in particular. So Colour in the Margins. When I first said this to someone, they went, "Oh, you're doing something on roadside verges." And no, actually, we're talking about cornfield flowers and the kind of forgotten flora of our farmland. And why do we want to save arable plants? Well, they're the fastest declining sweeter plants in the UK, and it's kind of been missed. We look at, you know, woodlands, and we look at wildflower meadows, and we tend to forget that there are cornfield flowers as well. And 70% of England is farmland. Now, that's not all arable. I don't actually have the figure for what is arable within that, but it's you know, around about 35 to 40% of that. The rest of it is grassland and other habitats as well, such as heathland and common land. And so it's arable farmland covers a huge amount of the countryside. And what's the purpose of arable plants, apart from, you know, they have some intrinsic value in their own right, but they're also the foundation for almost all of the other wildlife in the arable landscape. So they provide homes and food. They also are particularly important for certain stages of invertebrates. They can be a host for invertebrates that provide us with a pest control element, a natural pest control element, and they provide food for lots of small mammals, bats and beetles, so they're the foundation of the food chain, and they are important nesting habitat for farmland birds. So there's a huge wealth of things that they provide in terms of the natural environment. They also have really strong cultural connections with us. And when you talk to people, you know, they remember poppies, which is a symbol clearly of veterans and people lost in the wars. In France, that's actually the cornflower. And so there are things that we would miss if they were to disappear. Why are they declining? Well, there's kind of historical reasons for their decline and then more modern reasons, which I'll come on to. But after the Second World War, we became much more efficient. So we started cleaning seed. So rather than farmers taking their own seed and sowing it again the following year, and it wasn't cleaned, and so it would have these arable plant seed species in it, we started going to seed merchants who were much more efficient at creating a clean crop of seed to then sow in. We also started using herbicides, which, you know, the point of them is that they get rid of weeds. And so they really started to affect the diversity of our cornfield flowers. We also increased the use of fertilizers, particularly inorganic fertilizers, which benefited the crops, which is a good thing, but also benefited the nutrient-loving problem weeds that we hear so much about and that you're probably very familiar with, so the thistles and some of the grasses. Through this, we started to develop and breed modern crop varieties, and these crop varieties tend to tiller more, so they produce more flowering spikes. Again, that's a good thing because, of course, we want the grain for food, but it also creates a lot of shade, and that affects the arable plants because it casts shade and prevents some of the plants from perhaps growing and developing. There's also been changes over time from spring sown to autumn sown cereals. It depends where you are in the country as to how this is affected. So if you're in an area with heavy clay, you're more likely to have had autumn sown cereals throughout the whole of this period. Whereas there's still some spring sown cereals in some of the more free draining soil types. And I'm sure that Hannah and Ali will expand on that later on. There's also been some changes, which is now coming into the more modern reasons for decline, to do with our landscape and farming across our landscape. So particularly on some of the southwestern parts of the country and some of the sandy and shale soils, those areas which perhaps were not so good for growing crops have been converted to pasture. That's often ryegrass pasture, so it's not particularly flower rich. And there have been a very modern change and rise in growing of root vegetables, particularly as animal fodder, so things like beets. And there's been an increase in maize and oilseed rape in the last kind of 30 to 40 years. Maize is a particularly interesting plant. It comes from Central America. It requires heat to germinate and grow. It's often sown either under plastic in the UK or it's sown very late, you know, around about the end of April, even May, and that will cause it to grow and you know, it can then survive. And it doesn't have the same range of flora associated with it that wheat and barley would have. We've also increased the size of our fields and removed a lot of margin habitat with that. That's, you know, with taking out hedgerows, we remove the margins there as well. There's a big difference depending on the depth of cultivation that's really starting to affect, and we've been finding out that some of the changes in cultivation have affected arable plants. So there has been a move from ploughing, and that's turning over the soil, to something called minimum tillage or even direct drilling. So what happens there is the farmer would go in, they would spray off the vegetation using herbicide, and they would for minimum tillage, just disturb the top layer of the soil and then drill into that. Direct drilling is actually just going in and sowing the seed after the spray. So there's a double impact there, that it it uses herbicides, but also doesn't disturb the soil. There is a kind of counterpoint there, though, that carbon is saved by doing direct drilling and minimum tillage, whereas it's released by ploughing. So there's this kind of really big balance and difference that we're kind of trying to get right. And we have more efficient machinery now, so when people are going out to spray herbicides or fertilizers, they tend to get the edge of the crop as well. In the past, the margins were the kind of reservoirs for the arable plants, because they were able to stay there and survive, because the machinery wasn't quite as efficient. We are talking about weeds here. If we're talking to farmers, they think of them as weeds because they are growing in the wrong place. As you can see from this Farmers Weekly supplement in 1983, there has been a long history of trying to control species, and we also we found over time that some of the less competitive species, those that are more affected by arable by herbicides, have tended to decline, whereas those that have managed to become resistant have actually become more common and started to increase and then become problem weeds. And so we tend to tar things with the same brush. So what do we want to achieve through the project? So we really want to conserve the species communities unique to arable field margins. That's the common plants as well as the rare and threatened plants, because they need, the rare and threatened plants actually need the common plants as well as part of the community to bring in pollinators. They don't exist without each other. And there's quite a body of evidence now behind that. And the only way to do that really is to work with farmers and land managers, to enthuse them, to give them information, and also to learn from them as well how to make a difference. And through this project, we've worked with over 150 different farmers and land managers across England that have been really great at developing things and doing things for different arable plants. And we also want to work with everyone else who's joined in here and across the UK, to look at cornfield flowers and to think about why they are unique and perhaps why they have been forgotten. And it's not an arable desert when you go out into a cornfield. So thank you all for coming, really. We're one of the more wide-reaching projects across England. So we go all the way from Cornwall up to the Yorkshire Wolds, and we work across 3 different soil types. So sandy and shale soils, clay soils, and calcareous soils. We'll go into detail about that in a little bit in a little while. And we really work with farmers and land managers to think about how arable plants and communities of plants could be targeted for management to make sure that they can survive. And we think about things like limiting the fertilizer and herbicide applications in those areas, perhaps looking at some of the rotations, and so putting in grass lays, which are temporary grass covers, as another form of weed control, particularly if there are problem species there. We look at cultivation timing, whether if there are certain species there, whether it's better to cultivate in the autumn or the spring, but perhaps breaking that up as well, again for problem weed control, and looking at cultivation depth. And there is some cases where actually the plants were spread in the seed that was sown. So if that's the case, then we would be looking at perhaps even having to collect seed each year. So one of those species is corn cockle, which has a very short seed longevity in the soil. As I said in the quiz, the best management for arable plants and communities is cultivated margins or plots. And that's generally because it's the margins, the edges of the fields, which haven't suffered from herbicide sprays, and they tend to be less intensely managed in the past. But there are a whole range of different types of management that could be applied, and the triple SIs are actually all fields, and they have arable flora throughout the field, not just on the margins. So we're looking at species-rich arable plant areas, not just parts of fields. There are other types of things that could be applied. So cereal headlands are often used. There's also wild bird seed mixtures, which would also benefit some species of arable plants, and root vegetables as well, and management that can be applied to that. So that's the introduction of this. I'm going to now swiftly pass over to Hannah Gibbons to talk to us about sandy and shale soils. So Hannah, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let you share yours.
Okay, cool. Okay, is that good?
Yeah, that's great.
Cool, thanks, Kath. Okay, hi everyone. My name's Hannah. I've been largely working in Devon and Cornwall for the last 3 years on the Colour in the Margins project. And here is a photo to start with of a lovely species-rich arable field margin in South Devon, which was really lovely. So I just thought I'd start my bit of the presentation off with a nice picture. Oh, no, I can't find my presentation to... There we go. So I'll talk about a lot of these plants during the next 10-15 minutes whilst I go through my bit of the presentation. But these are the kinds of species that are characteristic of sandy and shaly soils. It's worth noting we'll largely be focusing on like wildflowers or herbaceous species, but actually there are a few grass species as well that are quite uncommon. So species that I often find down my way in Devon and Cornwall are lesser quaking grass, which is the top right of the photographs, which isn't a great image, but you can kind of get the impression. Very similar to the quaking grass that you find in species-rich calcareous grasslands, but this is an annual and it requires disturbance, and it also has a longer ligule as well. So there is a characteristic difference between the two species. And also rye brome, another species, the bottom right, which is another nice species I come across occasionally. So we do have grass, rare grass species too, as well as wildflowers. So this map just shows the sandy parts of the project area that Colour in the Margins have been working on. I haven't been to the Brecks, so I won't talk about any of the Breck speciality species. And also, so Devon and Cornwall is a sandy and shaly area, generally speaking. It's worth mentioning really, so Kath mentioned about cultivation timings, and in Devon and Cornwall, a lot of the arable fields along the coast are quite, they can be sprayed with salty water because they're so close to the coast, and so therefore if farmers cultivate in autumn or winter, their crops get kind of burnt by the salt. So that has encouraged farmers in those areas to actually cultivate it in spring, which has actually been really good for the arable plants in Devon and Cornwall, because a lot of them are spring germinating and they have been traditionally cultivated in spring for a long time. So as well as being spring cultivated, a lot of these arable fields that I've been surveying have been very close to the sea, which has been quite nice because I've been able to get a sea view on many survey day. I'm just going to talk about ramping fumitories to start with. I think Kath might talk about fumitories later. So although the genus Fumaria comprises ramping fumitories and fumitories, they are two separate groups really. So the ramping fumet trees tend to have flower lengths of 9 millimeters or longer. And when you're measuring the flower, you measure from the end of the spur, so the back end of the flower, to the front end of the flower, excluding the lower lip that kind of often projects out. So that's the length that you're kind of looking at. So whether they're over 9 millimeters or less. And so I'm talking about the ramping fumet trees that tend to be over 9 millimeters in length. And as you can see from these images, the ramping fumet trees and the fumet trees actually are very similar to look at. And you might just think, oh, they're basically the same plant, aren't they? But once you get your eye in, there's some nice subtle differences that help you figure out the different species. So common ramping fumet tree, the one on the left, is by far the most common species that you kind of come across, and it isn't wholly associated with arable fields. You can also find it in other habitats as well. So like disturbed, I don't know, just disturbed ground generally, really. And yes, this is quite a common species. And in this image, you can just about see where my cursor is, which hopefully you can see, that the little round fruit that emerges after the flower has matured and kind of dropped off. Tall ramping fumet tree is an uncommon species. So that's the second one in. I think on the whole, it looks a bit sickly and a bit more gappy. So the flowers tend to be further apart from each other. So it's quite distinctive, and the flowers are fairly small. So that's quite a nice one. Probably my favourite is Western ramping fumet tree, the third one in. This is quite a big fumet tree, and when you see it, you're like, oh, that's a bit of a corker. And Western ramping fumet tree has got a really nice characteristic in that the keel or the hood of the flower is white. So as you can see, hopefully where my cursor is, that's white. Because white ramping fumet tree is actually very similar. It's quite large, and they're very white in colour, both of them. But as you can see from here, the hood or the keel is actually purple in white ramping fumet tree. And in addition, white ramping fumet tree, the flowers, as they mature and as the fruits start to develop, the stem becomes reflexed. So the flowers kind of start to point downwards again. So that's quite a nice characteristic of that species. And also white ramping fumet tree, you can find it in hedge banks and various other places as well. It's not only associated with arable fields. And then here's an image of a fumet tree flower structure, and things that you'll kind of really great identification features of this group are the shape and the size of the sepal. So this weird little flap on the side of the plant, of the flower, sorry, the shape and the size of that can be really characteristic. And yeah, so that's quite good just to get your eye in terms of the different parts of the flower. Hopefully Liz will put a link to our fumet trees crib. So we've got a crib which helps you identify all these different species that we put together. And then this photo that I've taken, I've got quite a cool little hand lens, which has got a ruler on the inside. So it really helps with these measurements of these small lengths. I find it quite useful rather than using a massive ruler and trying to find how long things are. And you can see here how small the sepals and the different parts are, and also I just think they're really cool plants, and they look really nice when you zoom in on them. So a couple of daisies are quite characteristic of sandy and shaly soils. So corn marigold is an example of that. Very often find corn marigold in quite a lot of abundance. So where fields have been forgotten to be sprayed by herbicide, for example, or if certain little strips have been missed by the sprayer, you can often get lots of corn marigold coming up. In fact, in some places, corn marigold is starting to show a little bit of tolerance to herbicide. I wouldn't say it's exceptionally tolerant, but you can find a few flowers perhaps growing within the actual crop itself. Corn marigold has very waxy grey kind of leaves, so they're really easy to pick out as well. And it can look really, really glorious in fields that are managed specifically for farmland birds or for arable plants, because you can get a really nice swathe of a nice golden yellow colour. Cornflower is another species or a species of daisy, or in the daisy family, that you find in this sandy, shaly environment. A really characteristic plant. I think a lot of people would recognise cornflower. Unfortunately, it's actually become very uncommon nowadays. and it's not something I see very often, but when I do see it, it tends to be on organic land, and there's some theory that perhaps the seeds of this plant are actually being spread by organic seed providers, but I don't know how true that might be. But a really nice plant to see when you do spot it. Fluellens are probably another of my favourites. I really like seeing these. Round-leaved fluellen is ever so slightly less common than sharp-leaved fluellen. And as you can see from the images at the bottom, the leaves tend to have different shapes, and the sharp pokey bits at the bottom of the leaf obviously indicate sharp-leaved fluellen. It's worth noting, however, that sometimes the leaves don't strictly follow this rule. And actually, I find one of the better identification tips or features is that sharp-leaf fluellen, if you look at the flower stem, hopefully where I'm indicating now, it's hairless, wherefore for round-leaf fluellen, this stem has got lots of hairs on it. And also I find that, and these images are quite good for this, that round-leaf fluellen tends to kind of grow upwards, and sharp-leaf fluellen tends to be a bit more sprawling and straggly. In addition, another thing is that both flowers look very similar. As you can see, that's the round-leaf fluellen here, and this is the sharp-leaved. However, for sharp-leaved, the purple and the yellow combination is slightly lighter. So if you look at the round leaf fluellen, the purple is very, very dark. It's kind of bordering on a black purple coloration. So that's also something that's a little bit characteristic. But not only do they have a cool English name, fluellens, but they also have a really cool Latin name, Kixia. So again, 2 species to keep your eyes peeled for when you're on your arable field margin hunts. Toad flaxes, 2 other species that we tend to find in Devon and Cornwall. Weasel snout on the right, otherwise known as lesser snapdragon, which was one of the questions that you were asked at the beginning. This tends to be, it's not really very uncommon, but nationally it is uncommon. So I find it fairly regularly. It tends to be larger than small toad flax, and the flowers are more purple. For small toad flax, you can just about make out in this image that it has gland-tipped hairs, almost looks like mist or something that's kind of caught on the tip of the hairs. You can just about make that out from the image on the left, which is quite nice. Another thing that I've picked up, and I don't know if it's 100% true or not, is that I wouldn't be surprised if I found one small toad flax plant on its own, but with weasel snout, when you find one, you tend to find more. But that's just something I've noticed over the last couple of years, and I don't know if that's a thing or not. One of the species I've been working on very closely during the last couple of years is broad-fruited corn salad. And actually there are a few different corn salad species. Broad-fruited corn salad is actually endangered, and it may well be moved up a level possibly in the future to critically endangered, because actually the number of populations is really low. There's probably less than 20 populations currently present in the UK at the moment, and some of those are actually reintroductions, some of which I've actually done the reintroductions of, and we're not really sure how sustainable those populations are at those sites. So one really nice feature to help you identify corn salads is actually the shape of the fruit, which I guess the names broad-fruited and narrow-fruited kind of gives you a bit of a hint. And as you can see in this photograph bottom right, there's a comparison between broad-fruited and narrow-fruited in my hand, or both at the same time there. So the shape of the seeds for broad-fruited are quite inflated, and they look a little bit, they're kind of like the size and the shape of a grape pip. That's about the size you're kind of looking for, so they're still quite small. And as you can see from the image on the bottom left, the flowers are absolutely tiny, so it's quite a small, has quite small flowers, but the plant itself can be quite straggly and quite big overall. Usually, maximum I've seen it grow to about, I'd say 30 centimeters off the ground, but it kind of straggles around other things. So we've also created a crib, an identification crib for corn salads, and this is where these images have been taken from. And really the key feature here for identifying these species are the shapes of the fruits. And as you can see, bottom right is the broad-fruited corn salad, which is inflated in like both planes, I suppose, versus common corn salad, which is inflated in one plane. So it's quite narrow if you look at it from a different direction. So they're, I guess they're probably the two that you might muddle up initially, but also hairy fruited and narrow fruited corn salad are very, similar. And actually sometimes narrow fruited can be hairy, which also makes life a bit tricky. But if you look at the kind of pokey bit at the end of the fruit, you'll see that narrow fruited corn salad has a much more distinctive kind of point at the tip of the fruit, wherefore hairy fruited corn salad has lots of pointy bits that are kind of even in size. So that's really the key feature between the two. So they can be quite similar to look at. And if you have any queries, if you do find any of these, I would recommend just taking a few of the seeds and then sending them to Phil Wilson, who's the BSBI person for this group, and he can help you identify them, because I've had to send him some in the past, particularly of narrow fruited corn salad, because I wasn't quite sure if it was hairy fruited or not. So that's kind of a quick summary of those species. And I've been working on a site in South Devon for a few years now where this plant is present. It's the only site in Devon. And just a couple of photos really of the margins at this particular field. The first time I went there, there was a crop that had been sprayed and it was right up to the edge of the field and I didn't find anything. And then the second year, the farmer was up for trying to see if the population would regrow, and he put in this cultivated margin, as you can see here. So as Cath explained, it was cultivated, the whole field was cultivated, but then when the crop was sown, this margin was left, and then it was left unsprayed as well. So everything you can see, the poppies and the corn marigold, has all come up out of the seed bank naturally. This hasn't been sown, this is all natural. And there were tens of thousands of broad-fruited corn salads in there. What's interesting is the next year he wasn't able to cultivate in autumn, which is the favoured timing for this species, and he cultivated in spring. And although the cultivated margin's narrower, we found far fewer broad-fruited corn salad plants present. So a real indicator of how this particular species really favours autumn and winter cultivation. And catchflies is my last group that I'll be talking about. So these are closely related to campions, and both small flowered catchfly and night flowering catchfly have gland tipped hairs, and that gives them their catchfly name. So very often things kind of stick to them. So they might have dead flies attached to them or wisps of thistledown or something. So that's quite a nice characteristic of these species. Night flowering catchfly does what it says really in terms of the flower. It flowers at night time, so you can only tend to see the petals open during a dull day or the evening, and then they open at night. Wherefore small flowered catchfly, the flowers are just open, they're just kind of open during the daytime as you'd expect. Small flowered catchfly is quite a small plant, tends to grow to about 25 centimetres generally speaking, and it's one of my favourites because I've been working on it for ages, and it's a really nice one to see. And there's a few places down in Cornwall that you can definitely see this particular plant if you want to. So get in touch with us if you want to find where to head to. And in addition to working with farmers to try and change management, we've also been doing some reintroductions, and we've been working with Kew Millennium Seed Bank to carry out these reintroductions, and they provided us with the seed. And we've worked with lots of organisations and private farmers. And the middle photo shows a site in North Cornwall called Forbury Stitches that's owned by the National Trust. So we reintroduced small flowered catchfly to this very traditionally managed strip farming area of land at that particular site. And many of these reintroductions have been really successful, so that's been great. I think probably reintroduce small flowered catchfly to, by the end of the project, it will probably be about 25 sites. And so far, there's only been one site that the small flowered catchfly didn't grow at during the first year, and one site that the catchfly didn't grow at the second year. So I think it seems to be really positive. So hopefully we've really helped bolster the small flowered catchfly population in Devon and Cornwall. And that's it. So I shall stop sharing.
Hi, Hannah. So I'll take over here, and I'm just going to find my slideshow and share with you. Does that look okay?
Yeah.
Bro. Okay, so hi everyone, I'm going to talk a little about plants that you find on clay soils. Unlike Hannah, I never work beside the beach, and I must confess that this photo is actually taken by a professional photographer, so can't take any credit for it whatsoever. Oops, sorry. So clay soils are really heavy, they're slow to warm, they can be slow to dry, and they can lie wet. So they're actually quite tricky for farmers to work. They often have really short kind of cultivation windows to get their jobs done. And as Cath mentioned earlier, one of the things with clay soils is we've seen a movement from ploughing to non-invernal cultivation, so things like minimum tillage, and also move to autumn sown crops. But these are the species that really like clay soils, and a few of our species, thankfully, our priority species, have been autumn germinating, and they love these. So I'm going to go on and talk about some of the key features of these species. Just to let you all know, I'm getting a warning about my internet, so I'm sorry if I cut out, let me know. So in terms of clay soils, I've actually mostly been working in Somerset, and that's where we were initially focused our work, but we did move into working in Worcestershire and Cambridgeshire. And our priority species in these areas have been spreading hedge parsley and corn buttercup. And I'll talk about specifically more about some of the work we've done in those areas with those species at the end. But just a little bit about ID of some of the species that you come across in clay soils first. So spurges are a really nice one. Some people think they're a bit dull because they don't have proper flowers, I guess, but I actually really like them and can quite often be the most exciting thing that I find on a site. So like Hannah's kind of relationship with fluellens, I love spurges. Dwarf spurge looks really quite different from the other two species here. It's much smaller, it only grows up to about 20. And it has shorter leaves, about up to 3 centimetres, but they're narrow and come to a tip, and they have small, smooth. With broadleaf spurge, it's the tallest of the 3 species, and it grows up to 80 centimetres. It flowers from June to September, and it has these really distinctive warty fruits that you can see. If I move my cursor over here, you can see an illustration of the warty fruits. And again, we've got a fantastic crib sheet that shows all these. Sun spurge is the most common. It grows up to 50 centimetres. It starts flowering earlier in May, but does go into October. And it has these really distinctive 5-rayed umbel that you can see here. And it also has this whorl of bracts underneath, blunt-ended bracts, you can see underneath. And again, you can see by the illustration here, the fruit is smooth. So hopefully. And if we move on to daisies, so Cath already talked about stinking chamomile. It's classified as a vulnerable species. I do come across it quite a lot in Somerset. As its name suggests, it has quite an unpleasant smell. Some people say it smells like vomit. It certainly can be quite overwhelming if you're walking through a field of it, or if you're trying to do a quadrat survey that contains a lot of stinking chamomile, so beware. Corn chamomile, the next species here, is endangered and actually very rare. And it actually has hairy, sweet-smelling leaves. So they're distinct in those 2 features. Both these species, both stinking chamomile and corn chamomile, have scales, which you can see here. The yellow florets, you'll find some of these scales. And with stinking chamomile, they have this narrow spear-shaped tail with a pointed end. And in corn chamomile, you can see that it widens and it has a bristle tip, but it has this kind of appearance, so that's really characteristic of it. You obviously come across mayweeds, which are both common species. The way to tell between those is that scented mayweed has a hollow dome-shaped receptacle that's hollow in the middle. And with scentless mayweed, it also has a dome-shaped receptacle, but it's solid. So moving on to carrots, lots of carrots. These are some of the common species, so I won't spend too much time on those. Fool's parsley is grows up to 50 centimetres, is a hairless plant and has quite triangular leaves. It has really distinctive long bracteoles that hang down from the umbel here, so they're really noticeable. Hopefully you can see that. But they hang down to 1 centimetre, so that's a really distinctive feature of that plant. With these two, stone parsley and corn parsley, they grow in quite a similar way. They're very kind of sprawly and much branched. They have solid ridged stems and they can grow up to 1 metre, so quite big plants. Stone parsley, the leaves of stone parsley are said to have a petrol scent. I sometimes smell this, but not always, and some people don't smell it at all. However, they have, each leaf has 2 to 4 pairs of leaflets, which you can hear. And then if you compare that to corn parsley, each leaf has 4 to 12 pairs of leaflets. So it's quite like in its appearance. And we move on. There we go, sorry. So shepherd's needle, there's not really anything that you can confuse shepherd's needle with. It's a critically endangered species, but we're seeing it more and more, so that status might be reduced. It's very distinctive. It grows up to 60 centimetres and it's really bright green, and it has these really finely divided leaves that you can see. It flowers quite early, so it flowers from May, and I actually have some flowering already in my little arable plant patch in my garden. And these has these really characteristic fruits, which the name suggests, shepherd's needle. And they actually form shortly after flowering. So you start to see these fruits grow shortly after the flowers appear. So they're very characteristic and hard to miss. And they grow up to 5 centimetres. So they're really huge. It's quite a distinctive, very cool species. Getting a bit trickier now, moving on to hedge parsleys. So spreading hedge parsley in the middle here is one of our priority species for the project. It's endangered. It grows up to 20 centimetres, so it's quite short generally. It has a solid stem that's ridged towards the top of the plant, and it also has several main stems, so it is quite kind of spreading looking. The leaves, you can see here, I always feel that the leaves look really triangular in spreading hedge parsley, and also because it's here on both sides, both the upper and the underside. It has this really quite silvery appearance. It's quite a late flowering species, so it flowers from July to September. And again, we've got a fantastic crib sheet on the hedge parsleys, which is where these illustrations are from. But you can see the fruits here for the spreading hedge parsley are oblong, covered all over the fruit in these straight spines with little hooks at the tip. So if you compare that to knotted hedge parsley, which is classified as least concern. It also has several main stems, but the definitive feature or features between the two are that the flowers in knotted hedge parsley tend to have are either unstalked or short stalked, so they kind of had this clustered appearance along the stem, which is really distinctive. And their fruits, you can see here, are oval but only have spines on half of the fruit, so that's really distinctive between the two. Sometimes confusion with upright hedge parsley, which is the species on the far side of the screen here, can be a bit trickier. It grows taller, it tends to have one main stem. Its leaves are hairy only on the upper side, but all of these things are a bit tricky, I think. It flowers July to August, so there's an overlap in the flowering time as well. But really the definitive feature between the two is the fruits. And you can see here that the fruit kind of tapers towards the top, and it has which are curved but don't have any hooks on the end. But yeah, hedge parsleys are tricky. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about buttercups with prickly fruits. So of the three species that you can see here, corn buttercup is really the one that loves clay soils. It's critically endangered. Small flowered buttercup is actually associated with calcareous soils, and you would have seen that on Hannah's initial slide. And rough buttercup is more associated with sandier soils. So I think corn buttercup's a really pretty plant, and one of the most fantastic features of it is these fantastic illustrations of the seeds. But these seeds that used to be referred to as devil's claws. So they have these spines all over the seed, and even on the margins, which you can see the other two species don't have. And they have this long beak at the tip of the seed as well. But other things that differentiate the species are corn buttercup is the tallest. It grows up to 60 centimetres. It has leaves which are really deeply cut, so 3 lobed leaves which are really deeply cut. It has 5 sepals which are spreading, and the other 2 species, both small flowered and rough fruited, the sepals are reflexed. And it flowers, corn buttercup flowers May to July, but really you see it mostly the end of May, June. Whereas in small flowered buttercup, it flowers June, July, and rough fruited flowers March to April. So there's not really an overlap in the flowering period anyway. But as I said, corn buttercup is the one that loves clay soils. So I thought, just for the last bit of the talk, I wanted to talk a little bit about what we've learned about some of these. And firstly, I'm going to start off with spreading hedge parsley, which is this, I always feel spreading hedge parsley is a bit of a hard sell because it doesn't look that exciting, but it's a fantastic little plant. And I obviously love it because I've done so much work with it now. Worked with a couple of farmers in Somerset just to trial the effects of different cultivation methods on spreading hedge parsley. Excuse me. One farmer that we worked with near Taunton, we first recorded spreading hedge parsley in one of his fields in 2013 in a really awkward little field corner. So in autumn 2018, this field had been cultivated by minimum tillage. And when we visited in 2019, we found a really nice population, about 200 plants, spreading hedge parsley plants, and they were growing 1 to 2 metres into the winter wheat crop that was sown there. So in autumn of 2019, we had a little chat with the farmer, and he agreed to plough to see if that benefited the population. But when we returned in 2020 to do our survey, we found that although there was a similar number of plants, the plants weren't growing so far into the field. So they were actually concentrated in the less disturbed area adjacent to the grass margin, and were growing less into the crop that had been, the land that had been ploughed. The plough had managed to reach it. So that was interesting. And another one of our farms, we'd had records of spreading hedge parsley since the 1990s. And here the landowners were really not keen to plough. They wanted to maintain non-inversion cultivation. They wanted to direct drill. But they were really keen to try and do something for arable plants. So in autumn 2019, they trialled 2 cultivated uncropped plots. So the entire field was strip tilled, and they left one undrilled plot in the northern margin and one in the southern margin, because these that we knew had good populations of spreading hedge parsley in the past. And amazingly, when we returned in 2020 to undertake a survey, we found an average of 20 plants per square metre in both plots. So actually 150 plants in the plot, which was bigger, the northern plot, and 60 in the southern plot. And also we had lots of other species popping up there, like huge amounts of shepherd's needle, dwarf spurge and broadleaf spurge, which although they'd all previously been recorded, were all in really small numbers before. So that was a fantastic result. And so these 2 cases suggest to us that spreading hedge parsley is actually perfectly happy with minimum tillage and doesn't need ploughing, which kind of goes against the message that we'd always been talking about, ploughing for arable plants. So spreading hedge parsley is a bit different in that respect. However, it has brought about another challenge for us, that minimum tillage actually doesn't disturb the soil enough to get rid of all the grassy vegetation that can develop. So in cropped areas, herbicides would normally be used to combat those, but obviously we don't want to use herbicides in areas that are being conserved for arable plants. So now we're going to tackle about how do we control problem species that might pop up in these plots that are managed under minimum tillage. And then with corn buttercup, have worked on, done a lot of work with Worcestershire Wildlife Trust and one of their reserves, Knowlton Fields, which is 2 fields. And in autumn 2018, they undertook a cultivation trial, comparing ploughing and minimum tillage. And in each field, the inversion ploughed one area and left another area under minimum tillage. Turned in 2019 to survey these areas, it was very obvious that there were big populations of corn buttercup in both the ploughed areas, but there was no corn buttercup at all in the areas that had been cultivated by minimum tillage, which suggests a really strong preference for ploughing. But we also found with corn buttercup, through our work with Kew Millennium Seed Bank, that corn buttercup has a very complex dormancy. So it sheds its seeds, that's a bit of a tongue twister, when they're immature, so they still need time to mature after they've fallen from the plant. And the seeds also form a hard seed coat, which you saw in the ID slide earlier. And so this hard seed coat requires weathering and microbial action to break it down before germination can occur. So this is it's good news because it's good to know, because it It might explain why you don't see corn buttercup at a known site in a season. It might need to be buried for a couple of years for the germination to occur. It also kind of poses a problem for us because we know that it needs ploughing for germination to occur, to bury the seeds. But in the areas in Worcestershire, where we have these big populations, there has been a move to minimum tillage and less ploughing. So we found out a lot, but there's still a lot to learn. And on that note, I think I'm handing over to Cath. So I'm going to stop sharing. Cath?
Cath, have we got you there? Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to share my screen again. So I'm going to talk for the final part about the plants of calcareous soils, and I'm going to do this quite quickly because I know that we're running out of time, aren't we, Kieran? So I will speed it up a bit. So I'm sorry that I won't go into as much ID as some of the others. Fortunately, I don't have to go into quite as much as that because Hannah and Ali have done such a great job. So plants of calcareous soils. Calcareous soils, the flora associated with calcareous soils tends to be the most diverse out of any of the arable floras. And I think this is because it has its own set of plants, such as pheasant sign, red hemp nettle and prickly poppy. But also it can borrow plants as well. So prickly poppy also occurs on sandy, free draining soils as well, like nightflower and catchfly and rye brome. So it kind of shares a lot of species with some of the others. We've worked in 4 areas of calcareous soils. So the Wessex area, the North Downs, the Yorkshire Wolds, and then we've actually added the Cotswolds as well, partly to do with some of the red hemp nettle that's in that particular area, which I'll come on to at the end of this. So there's 5 species of poppy, although there's actually 6, but 2 of them look very, very similar, long-headed poppy and yellow juice poppy, that grow on disturbed ground. So common poppy and long-headed poppy tend to be quite common across the UK. Yellow juice poppy is what it says. If you were to break off a leaf, you'll see that it has a yellow latex sap that comes out. It's slightly rarer as well. And opium poppy has escaped into the wild. It's grown for medicinal purposes in the UK and harvested as a crop. So, you know, it's a very useful plant as well. Bees in particular love poppy pollen. It only contains pollen, it doesn't have nectar, and they have been found to visit it to get the pollen and to then get the amino acids and the proteins that are within that pollen. And they will do that even if there are other nectar and pollen producing plants nearby. We think that's because it contains certain amino acids that they can't get elsewhere. There's 2 species of poppy which are actually quite rare. One of which is prickly poppy, which is vulnerable, and it has bright blue pollen and a longer seed head with spines on it, and rough poppy, where the picture's not quite as bulbous as perhaps it is. It's got light blue pollen and darker petals. Prickly poppy is particularly difficult to spot because the petals can drop off within a couple of hours, and it opens up at the beginning of the day, so it can be missed quite quickly. The forget-me-not family is something that's often missed on arable land, and you know, there's 3 species that I'm just mentioning here. So field forget-me-not, hopefully most of you are familiar with forget-me-not, the 5-petaled forget-me-nots with the yellow centre, but bugloss looks slightly different and tends to have quite rough leaves. Field gromwell is endangered. It can sometimes be known as corn gromwell as well, and it's just changed its name to Buglosoides arvensis, which is another tongue twister. the hotspot for this plant seems to be in the Wessex area, and it really is one of the calcareous soil specialists, but it's also grown as a crop for omega-3 oil, which is used quite a lot in vegetarian and vegan foods. So it's got a food use as well as being, you know, a very rare plant. So you can come across whole fields of it. Fortunately, Hannah did such a great job of explaining fumitories that I don't need to go into the detail. So these are the fumitories which are where the flowers are smaller than 9 millimeters. There's actually 4 types that you tend to find on calcareous fields. Common fumitory crosses the boundaries though, and will come up on other in other areas. And the one that's missing is few flowered fumitory. It's very difficult to tell it apart actually from common fumitory. You need to look at the sepal to see the difference and the number of flowers that are there clearly from the name. Dense flowered fumitory, although it looks slightly similar, if you have a look, and if you can just see my cursor, this is one of the sepals. So the sepal is absolutely massive. I think that it makes the flower look fluffy. And so you can spot it from a distance compared to common fumitory. And finely fumitory, the flowers are actually really quite small, and they're also white with the bright pink middle petal, lateral petal. There are 2 bell flowers associated with calcareous soils. The one that you're going to find more often is Venus's looking glass, which has a small flower and quite a long triangular seed pod below the flower. There's only one margin in Hampshire with greater Venus's looking glass. It has a much larger flower, about 1.5 centimeters across, and this triangular seed pod is much shorter. The reason why it's called Venus's looking glass is because the seeds within the seed pod are slightly shiny, and so it picked up that name. Buttercups. So this is an unusual member of the buttercup family, which doesn't really look like a buttercup at all. If you were to just see it in leaf, you would probably think that it was either a mayweed, or if you sort of caught it at the wrong angle, perhaps even a fumitory. It's also, the flower doesn't look like a buttercup, apart from the fact that the petals are quite iridescent. So this is pheasant's eye, and pheasant's eye is incredibly rare and becoming rarer, unfortunately. It's a really striking plant to see. So we've put it together with the you know, in the buttercup's crib. So if you wanted to have a look at that, you would see the differences between that. But we spent a lot of time on the project working on this species because it has quite a complex seed dormancy process, and to get it to germinate. So one of the ways of thinking about the conservation is to look at doing reintroductions, and that posed a problem for this particular plant. The life cycle of pheasant's eye is that it germinates in the autumn. It then rests over winter as a rosette, and then starts to grow flowering spikes in early spring. It's actually flowering now, and fortunately I'm going out to look at some of the reintroduction plots later this week, and I've been told that there are some in flower. I was a little bit worried because it's quite difficult to find when it's not in flower. You're looking for a green thing that looks like a mayweed, usually within an area with lots of mayweeds. So we needed to think about it, and the reason why the seeds are difficult to introduce is because when it's shed in June, July time, the embryo inside the seed is immature. It needs to bask in the sun and absorb that heat, which then matures the seed. And then, being a buttercup, it's got that hard seed coat that it then needs to break open. And so you don't necessarily get germination every year. In fact, we saw a really big boom of germination in 2019 because the summer of 2018 was so hot. It causes a problem for us because If the seed is already there, it's absolutely fine. You cultivate in the autumn, it will grow, it will develop. If you want to reintroduce the seed, you've got to reintroduce it before the end of July onto bare ground. But if you leave that bare ground there, it tends to develop quite a cover of grasses and other vegetation, which then overshade and swamp out the seed and swamp out the seedlings when it, if they start to grow, if they actually manage to mature. So we did a couple of different trials. The first trial was to sow onto prepared plots before the end of July to see if the seeds germinated there. And the second one was to ask Hugh to do a heat treatment for us, where they put it in their ovens for about 3 to 4 weeks, and then gave it a short, sharp shock of humidity right at the end to break that seed coat. And then we sowed it before the end of August. And we were really lucky, actually, at both of the sites where we sowed the seed before the end of July in Wiltshire and Kent. It germinated the following year, and it also germinated from the heat, artificial heating treatment. So we now know how to bring this seed back and how to bring this plant back using the seed. The other thing that we found out is that although it likes calcareous land, it can also grow on clay. And this picture was actually a plant growing on calcareous clays. And it's absolutely massive with lots of flower heads. You find that on calcareous, chalky, free draining soil, there's lots and lots of plants, but they might only have one flower on them, and they're tiny in comparison. So there's a really big difference, and we don't have much information about this. We're still collecting information. So the final set of species that I'm going to talk about are the hemp nettles. So common hemp nettle and bifid hemp nettle are quite common, and you'll find them in all sorts of soil types across the country. Downy hemp nettle, we believe, is extinct. The last time it was seen was in a field near Bangor in 1975. And actually one of the reasons why it went extinct was the farmer decided not to cultivate that field any longer because he was so fed up of people coming to see the plant. So it's one of those where if we were to find it, we probably wouldn't ever tell anyone where it is because we don't want that to happen again. Large flowered hemp nettle tends to grow in damper areas and often with a slightly more northern climate or wetter climate, so it isn't very coastal. But the one I really want to concentrate on now is red hemp nettle, because again it's critically endangered, very rare. It grows in arable fields, but also grows in quarries and shingle scree slopes and shingle beaches, so it can cross over the habitats as well. And we've done, again, a lot of work on this species, working with Q to find out how to reintroduce it. So hemp nettles have a hard seed coat that can take years to actually degrade enough for water to get in and start to grow. We ask you to grow some seed on in the Cotswold, from a Cotswold population, to create a resource for us that we could then sow into reintroduction plots. And we noticed something a little bit odd about the seeds that were starting to be grown, that there seemed to be 2 different phenotypes, 2 different looks to the plant. So at the bottom, we've got this long, kind of quite large flowered plant, and the top picture shows actually a much shorter, slightly wider leaved and smaller flowered plant. Now they're both red hemp nettle, and we're not quite sure why and how this has developed, and whether it's just the Cotswolds population, and there's so few populations, I think that there's only 1, maybe 2 in the Cotswolds that are remaining, or whether this actually affects other populations as well, and whether there has been genetic drift over time and partly brought on by isolation, and what's happened in this particular area. And so the picture with all the red flags, the flags mark a reintroduction site where we found over 1,000 plants of red hemp nettle showing either one of these 2 characteristics. Unfortunately, we found out today that we've got some money to do some tissue sampling of these different plants, and also looking at geographical spread around the country to see if there is a diversity in terms of the genetics. So we now know how to reintroduce red hemp nettle by sowing in the autumn, to let the seed coat weaken. It then germinates in the spring. We now need to know what to use and where to use it. So it's quite exciting, quite, you know, developing times. So that's the end of the bit about calcareous plants. I just wanted to point out some of the problem plants as well. So these are the nutrient loving plants that we get around, and I'm pretty sure that quite a few of them, like creeping thistle, spear thistle, common nettle, and docks, will be familiar to you. The grasses perhaps not so, depending on whether you come across them before, but you know, common couch is a plant that will grow and keep coming back in certain areas. It has a good root system, as does perennial sow thistle, which we're seeing increase as well. Blackgrass is a major problem now in fields where farmers are really struggling to control it, and especially because it's become resistant to herbicides. So what do you want to do if you want to know a little bit more about rare arable plants? Well, you can download the Rare Arable Flower app. This is available on both iPhone and Android devices, and you can get it by searching the various download stores, and it gives you a bit of information about identification. You can record sightings if you want to record sightings, but we would always advise that any sightings are actually sent directly to the BSBI vascular plant recorder, so that they can verify the plant. If you want more information about arable plants, the other thing to do is to go to the Back from the Brink Colour in the Margins page. So all of the crib sheets that Lizzie has been putting up, along with species information sheets, the information that I've talked about for red hemp nettle, and very soon for pheasant's eye, and also Hannah has talked about for small flowered catchfly. We've got lots and lots of things up there that you can download and you can read at your own leisure. If you want to find out more about arable plants and their habitats, please go to the Plant Life website and have a look at the arable farmland pages. And there's lots of stuff like important arable plant areas and how we actually monitor them. And if you want to know more about management, please go to Farm Wildlife website, and they've got things like the 6-point plan there, so looking at what you've got at the moment and then thinking about how to manage for that. So the final thing is, we thought we would throw in another quiz for you just to see how you got on and to do that. So we'll give you a couple of minutes to fill this in, and I will go through them. I think I would like to say a really big thank you to FSC, Ali, Hannah and Lizzie, and everyone who's helped with this. If you want to go and see arable plants, well, we're coming up to a really good time to get out and find them. And there are places that you can go to see them. For example, if you're in Devon, you could go to Dawlish Country Park, which has some plots with small flowered catchfly that Hannah sowed. There's an interpretation board there as well, so feel free to go and have a look. In Somerset, there is 5-head arable fields, SSSI. Again, it's free to enter. There's an interpretation board there. It's 4 fields and it's clay soils, and you will see an amazing variety of arable plants. If you're in the east of the country, I would advise that you go to Ranscombe Farm in Kent and have a look at the arable plants on that reserve that's owned by Plant Life. So it's completely free to go in there. If you make your way over to Kitchen Fields, you can see if you can find ground pine. If you do find it, remember to give it a sniff because it smells like pines. So just coming on to the quiz. So which habitats is red hemp nettle found in? Is it arable farmland, shingle beaches, chalk quarries, or all of them? Which species is used as charms in people's clothes? Is it shepherd's purse, field pennycress, or common speedwell? Which birds may nest in plots in arable fields? Stone curlews, lapwings, skylarks, or all of them? How far do Searle buntings travel between their nesting and overwintering homes? Is it 2 kilometres, 4 kilometres, or 6 kilometres? What is the main food of the bush-thighed seed-eater beetle? That's a mouthful. Cornspurry, small-toed flax, knotted hedge parsley, or fat hen? Which family does pheasant side belong to? Dead nettle family, buttercup family, or daisy family? How can you distinguish spreading hedge parsley from other hedge parsley species? Is it that straight spines cover just half the seed, or straight spines cover all over the seed, or hooked spines all over the seed? And why are catchfly plants called catchflies? Do they have sticky hairs behind the flower that flies get caught on? Are they carnivorous plants that eat flies, or does the flower head close at night catching flies? Number 9 is, what is an alternative name for corn buttercup? Is it devil's claw, spiny catcher, or buttery butterface? And which species seed lasts the longest in the soil seed bank? Common poppy, shepherd's needle, or corncockle? So hopefully you've all had a go at that. So if we end the poll and then have a look at the answers. So red nettle is found in all of the different places that were mentioned there. And of course, pheasant's eye is a member of the buttercup family. The species that are used in charms in people's clothes is common field speedwell, I think, and it's just been switched with number 4 on the poll. Which birds may nest in plots in arable fields? It's actually all of them, and you can see them. Stone curlews are protected, so actually if stone curlews are nesting in plots and there's rare arable plants there, we can't go and survey because we don't want to we don't want to disturb any of the birds anyway. Searle buntings actually only travel 2 kilometres between their nesting and overwintering homes, which is absolutely amazing that they just have this really small area that they live in. And the bush-thighed seed eater is its main food source is fat hen. And yeah, I can say Harpalus. I think it's Frolicii. I'm sure that someone will correct my pronunciation of the scientific name. So the distinguishing feature of spreading hedge parsley is the hooked spines all over the seed, and it's the sticky hairs behind the flower that flies get caught on, which is the reason why catchflies are called catchflies. The alternative name for corn buttercup is devil's claw, and this species seed that lasts longest in the soil seed bank is common poppy. So that is the end of the presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing now and invite everyone to come back and pass over to Lizzie actually to ask us any questions.
Before we go to Lizzie, we've actually got 2 people that want to ask their questions themselves. So we're going to put you guys on the spot before Lizzie's filtered questions come through, if that's okay. If anybody would like to turn their video back on now, they're more than welcome to. Be aware that we are still recording, so you may appear in the recording if you do so, but we're happy to see your faces now that we've stopped the presentation. So Gillian, you've patiently had your virtual hand up for about 1 hour, so I'm going to come to you first. If you can just let us know who your question is for before you tell us your question, that'd be great. And we'll just need to get you off mute as well.
I don't really know anymore, Kieran, such a long time ago, but on the slide with the weeds that farmers like least, there was a dirty dozen slide of least liked weeds, and I just wondered what they were, other than, it was one of the very first slides, other than things like creeping thistle and couch grass. It's not important if you can't find the slide.
think that may have been during your part of the talk, Kath.
I think it was Cath's rather than Hannah's.
I'm sorry, I missed the question because my internet actually cut out. So I got something about couch grass at the end. Could you ask it again, please?
In one of your slides, you had a picture of the dirty dozen worst weeds that farmers don't like.
Yes.
And in the slide, you couldn't catch what the names were. You couldn't really see what the plants were very well.
No.
I wondered whether we could either see that again or whether a link could go into the chat for that.
What I could do is I could send because you won't see it, it's very small, but I could send the picture to Kieran, and because we scanned it all. I mean, it's a fascinating document, look at it that way. But there are things like cornspurry, which we now consider quite rare, and corn marigold were featured on there as things that farmers wanted to get rid of, so it is, in a way, it's very telling that then they were quite common and now they're very rare, that we think of them, corn marigold, where it does grow, it's quite prolific, but it's actually vulnerable in the UK. So it is a problem. And some of the things, the picture of here today, gone tomorrow, Saturday to Sunday, and spraying off and getting things. And that's what they would be, the farmers were being encouraged to do. And so, and yes, we did need to do it to a certain degree, but we've lost a huge amount by using sprays and things. So yeah, but I can send that particular picture to Kieran to circulate it if you would like.
Thanks, Kath. Kat, would you like to ask your question and just let us know who it's for?
It's not really for anybody. It's a general question because nobody mentioned the fact that maybe birds can spread seed in the droppings that they go through the birds' stomachs. Was that a factor in sort of talking about spread of seeds? Because I went to Y College, and a friend who was doing a PhD found that. Or a colleague found that using hydrochloric acid sometimes broke the dormancy of certain seeds, which were really hard. So just throwing that out there, and if somebody wants to reply and get back to me.
First one to unmute gets it.
If they want to.
I'll do it. I think you're quite right. I think birds can spread seed. We find that with the rare things, because they are so rare, that seed doesn't get spread as much, and they tend to be very, I don't know whether it's loyal or they tend to occur in the same places every single time. So you can go back to the same field, you find it in the same corner. Why it hasn't moved because of the cultivation to a different part of the field, no one really knows. That might be because it's at the top of a slope or bottom of a slope or something like that. Yeah. But you would expect some kind of movement, but it's definitely common stuff. I would completely agree. And of course, anything that's wind blown, any of the thistles. The other thing that actually we neglected to mention, that just because they might be referred to as problem weeds doesn't mean that they aren't beneficial for invertebrates, particularly things like thistles, which are very good pollinator plants. But you don't want too much of them. As a farmer, you don't want them because they can get into the crops and become a problem. So, and as I said at the beginning, some of the plants provide particular homes for certain life stages of invertebrates as well. So I think we concentrate on the word weed quite a lot. And what we've been doing with farmers is changing how we address arable plants. So we start to call them cornfield flowers because it's, they are part of cornfields, and it makes it less of a thing. But we also start talking about growing them as a crop. When we're talking about an arable plant or cornfield flower margin, we're talking about growing a crop of weeds. That's what actually you want to achieve. And depending on who you talk.
Ooh.
I don't know if Hannah or Ali can add anything on.
Yeah, no, it's just I did a study on comparing crop weeds they were called then, in arable, in organic and non-organic fields. And yeah, so I wish I'd been able to call them sort of different names except weeds. Fumetry was loved. I loved fumetry.
Okay, thanks, Kat. Thanks, Kath. Right, we'll take one more question from the audience, and then I'll ask Lizzie for any burning questions. Patrick, would you like to let us know who your question is for, and let us know what the question is?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Patrick Barker, I'm a farmer from Suffolk. I can't seem to video myself at the moment, which says the host has done that. So if you'd like to do that, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, so we're doing quite a bit of work with the AB11 cultivated margins as part of our environmental stewardship schemes, but without kind of in-depth surveys. We're just following prescriptions kind of blindly at the moment, as set out by Natural England and by our stewardship schemes. So I think really it's a question for Alison, maybe, because we're on kind of heavy clay land, but also everyone else who wants to chip in. Is there a way we can determine what we should be looking for and tailor our management to it? Or do we go down the route of the kind of boring, usual cultivate half in the autumn, half in the spring management, see what comes, and then look to tailor our management accordingly, do you think?
Sorry, I was having trouble unmuting there. I must admit, and you can tell by my accent, that I do not come from England. I've never been to Suffolk. So in generally with clay soils, we tend to work, or kind of most species are autumn germinating. So we advise actually cultivation in the autumn. I don't know, and maybe Lizzie might have an idea about a botany group in Suffolk. If there'd be anyone in the area that would be willing to come out and survey your land. Because quite often, if you've got an active botany group in the area, there will be someone that would be happy to do that. That would be a great help for you to be able to then target your management towards the species that you have occurring.
I don't know of a botany group in Suffolk specifically, but we can find you the details of somebody who might, the BSBI Vice County Recorder in Suffolk. Otherwise, check out our website we've got sort of guidance on managing for clay habitats, for clay soils on the website.
Oh, sorry, Kath, were you going to say something?
Well, the only thing that we could offer you, if you wanted, is we can do some historical record searches of the vascular plant database and send you a kind of a list of species that have been found close by or on your land, perhaps along, if you've never had a survey, there might have been someone walking along a road at some point in the last 100 years, which is where we take the data from. And so we can do that. We just need some information. So I think Lizzie has popped in the chat the email address for the project, which is colour in the margins, all one word, @plantlife.org.uk. Please email that and we can see if we can help you. We will need some details from you, like your land holding, but very happy to do that and to see what could be about if there are records.
I thought it might be worth mentioning that there's a survey methodology which is called the IAPA, which is the Important Arable Plant Area Survey, which is a bit of a mouthful. Sorry, my cat's going to try and attack me. And that, if you look at the documentation on our website that refers to that methodology, it's got a list of all the species and then how rare or common they are. And depending on the commonness of the species. So if it's really rare, then it gets a higher score. And if it's more common, it gets a lower score. And so that might be a good way for you to figure out which management is more effective, depending on the IAPA score of your autumn cultivated areas and your spring cultivated areas. And then it also gives you an idea of which species are more common and which are rarer. So therefore you might be able to do more research on those rarer species and then try and target them in terms of your management.
Thanks, everyone. Brilliant. Right, Lizzie, I think what we might do is come to you quickly for any questions from the chat. We've already overrun by a bit, so I think it will be burning questions only. So over to you, Lizzie, and let the guys know who you're addressing them to.
Okay, we've got a few questions from somebody called Babetty, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, about what's the best time of year to go to various different sites. So we're after Hannah, going to Cornwall at the end of May, beginning of June. Where would you recommend? I'll just go through them all and then you can respond. Cath, would late June be too late? Would late June be too late for Adonis annua? It's pheasant's eye. And Ali, for 5 heads, is the end of June good?
I'll go first then. I did respond directly actually, and I put a list of sites that you could go to in Cornwall. I just thought rather than me waffling on, but in terms of timing, end of May and beginning of June is quite good for seeing arable plant communities. If you wanted to see small flowered catchfly, you may well get it. Although because the weather's been a bit cold and now wet, actually cultivation timings appear to be quite late this year in the southwest. So it might be that end of May might be a bit too early, but I'm sure you'll see something in flower. So places where I thought you might want to visit would be, there's a site down at the Lizard called Windmill Farm, which is a Cornwall Wildlife Trust Reserve. We put some small flowered catchfly seeds in there and it was very, very successful. And there's some other species as well, such as cornsbury and field woundwort. So that could be a good site. Also Forbury Stitches along the North Cornwall coast near Boscastle. That's got lots of weasel snout and lots of corn marigold, and there's also a reintroduction there of small flowered catchfly too. So I'd say those 2 sites would be good, but in that email, that message that I messaged back, there's a couple of other ideas of places to visit.
So in terms of pheasant's eye, I think late June would probably be too late. I mean, we really do now have found that it's starting to flower beginning of May, even this year, which is slightly later because of the kind of continuing frosts that we've been getting. We know it's in flower already. It's really tough to see when it's not in flower. The only site that I know that is easily accessible with pheasant's eye, and you would still have to go on and search for the plots, would be Ranscombe Farm in Kent, where you can get on, and that's because it's part of the trials that Plant Life have been doing. Our now retired reserve manager, Richard Moyse, emailed me at the beginning of this week actually, because he was going to check out the pheasant's eye, and he found that it hadn't started flowering just yet. He found 3 plants, but flowering is imminent. So if you want to go, you need to look at going really in the next couple of weeks, and hopefully it will be there. And then, of course, you might want to go back in June to see the other things that flower slightly later.
Lovely, thank you.
Is it my turn? So 5 head arable field, I would actually recommend if you are in the Somerset area, you must visit. So it's a reserve that's managed for its arable plant assemblage. So it's full fields of arable plants. It's amazing. And I think you asked if you should visit in June. Is that right?
I was asking about the corn buttercup in particular, whether it might not be the right time.
So June is a good time for corn buttercup actually. And as you enter the reserve, Cath mentioned that it's 4 fields. The field right in front of you will be hopefully stuffed with corn buttercup. It's quite a sight. Last year we had a count of 17,000 plants.
Wow.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
But you will also see spreading hedge parsley there. At that time it might not, but it will be in flower. And you can compare broad-fruited and narrow-fruited corn salads as well. So
fantastic.
Nice.
Thank you so much, all 3 of you. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're probably going to have to wrap it up there. So thank you to the Plant Life team for a great talk. I just want to let everybody know, because there's been loads of really useful information and links going in the chat. You can actually save the chat as a participant. You just click on the chat button at the bottom, and then in the window that pops up or that is on the right hand screen, there's a little box with 3 little dots. If you click on that, there is an option to save the chat. So I recommend doing that if you want to save those links. On that note, I'm going to stop the recording.